What I'd like to do is to provide a context for this site, in other words the background to the potential use of this for this site, because it's really important to understand what if you like, the archaeological evidence for settlement in Swaledale, which includes the wide-ranging coaxial field systems which you all have seen on the moors, the large fields that go right up from the present-day pastures way up onto the high moorland. Well, most recently these field systems have been interpreted as sheep runs. In other words, the activity that was the principal activity here, the economic activity, the activity which provided a living, if you like, to the people, to the quite high population that was present in Swaledale. We've got, as the television programme indicated the other day, there are settlements and like this one at intervals all the way along the dale sides, on both sides of the dale. On the Hilo pastures, the settlements are at 400-metre intervals on the dale sides, and on in Grinton pastures there are also numbers of settlements, potentially of the Iron Age, potentially of the early Roman period, and potentially of the post-Roman period in the pastures. So that all the evidence suggests that Swaledale had a population which was fairly close to and the settlement pattern was pretty well similar to the pattern that exists today, i.e. small farmsteads separated by up to 300 or 400 yards on both sides of the dale. And we can only guess basically whether or not there were village type settlements at Reeth. We don't know. Nobody's excavated at Reeth. Anyway, what were these people doing? Well, there is evidence actually in the Roman literature for an expansion in the trade of woolen finished goods, principally cloaks for the Roman army, an expanding trade in finished woolens across the Channel to Europe. Britain has always made a living from producing wool. Grass grows well in Britain and sheep do well, and wool is a principal product of Britain, in common with tin, if you like, minerals like copper, but also wool and meat could have been produced in Swaledale much as they are today. To come to this site, that's the background to this site. We've been very fortunate, I think, in exposing a large area of paved floors which have the appearance of being buildings, and I'm quite sure that that they may well have been stores or yards. They don't appear to be dwelling places. We have no evidence that the structures that we've seen yet were actual dwellings. There are no hearths. There's no indication that the stones were burned, which they would have been if there'd been a hearth. There are no querns or millstones, so cereals were not being processed or being grown in this area. We've no evidence that cereals were being either processed, they were not milling wheat or barley. It would be barley actually, probably. Anyway, there are no quernstones, no millstones. And the most significant fact is there are no butchered animal bones. So if there were a couple of families living here, and they were living here permanently, and this was a settlement or a farmstead in the general sense of the word, in other words, a couple of farmhouses, and there would be barns, and there would be yards, and there would be an outer fence. We haven't found the house or the farmhouse yet. We haven't found any evidence for people actually living here. So, and the absence of actual butchered animal bone indicates that the people who are living here were actually concerned with raising animals. They were concerned with their sheep. Shepherds would have to be in attendance all the time. They could not leave their animals alone at night. They had to be with their animals at all times, because during the Roman period the animals that existed here that would definitely make short work of the sheep were wolves, fox, lynx were present. It's hard to believe, but the lynx, which is it's actually a very interesting cat. Anyway, the bones of lynx have been found and dated to 400 AD, and that has those dates are from Yorkshire caves. So there were lynx present here. There was wildcat. There were eagles. The sheep could not be left unattended, so the shepherds would actually live with their sheep. It's quite possible, and actually the sheep would have been milked, and sheep cheese would have been a major product. There were two products: cheese, if you like, based on sheep milk, cheese and wool, and lambs. Although the lambs would not necessarily be killed here, they'd be taken down, they'd be herded down valley and sold on. They would not be butchered here. There's no market for large numbers of lamb in Swaledale. They have to be taken down to the lowlands, to the towns, if you like, to York and elsewhere. But the animals were not killed here. They were reared here. They were born and bred here. Okay? So this site, on the basis of the information we have at the moment, could be interpreted as a sheep house. Now, during the medieval period, during the period where the great estates were the monastery estates, if you like, the monasteries had large estates throughout the Dales, and they reared large numbers of sheep for exactly the same reasons: for meat, for cheese, and for wool. This is how the great monasteries actually made a living. That's how they supported themselves. And the medieval evidence for sheep houses is everywhere in the Dales. Sheep houses have been recorded by Stephen Moorhouse, especially in Wharfdale and elsewhere. We haven't actually recognised any in Swaledale, but I'm sure they are here. So we may have here the equivalent of basically a sheep house, which is where the sheep are gathered in, and they're actually milked, and the cheese is made, and they spend the night here. And so what we might find actually is a fairly simple dwellings of shepherding families, if you like. They will most likely be where we're standing. A couple of things. Firstly, I did mention this could simply be a sheep house. Don't underestimate that. This would be a significant place, because there would be very large flocks of sheep, and they had to be treated somewhere, and they had to be dealt with, and the milk and the cheese had to be made, and it had to be processed, it had to be stored, and it had to be taken away. The animals were looked after, and they were kept dry, and they were kept safe. But that is only one, if you like, of the possible interpretations of this site. I would not be surprised if you did actually find at least two really good roundhouses here that may well, in other words, it could still be a major settlement. The evidence against that is the absence of butchered bones, because I mean, if people are living here at family strength, and if they were eating meat rather than protecting you see, shepherds, if you go to Greece, they never kill their animals unless they have to. They keep their animals. They're precious. They rarely actually eat their own animals, but they do eat basically cheese and so on, and they sell their products. Their animals are too important to actually be butchered. So we may indeed still have, they may well have a settlement. The other point, the last point, is the glass bangle that was found. Now this is a marvellous find. There are basically, it's a long story, and I shall be actually providing the information on the glass. The glass was blue glass, and it had trailing white, opaque white decoration. Glass of that type was present in Europe 400 BC. It was found on one of the high status Iron Age sites in Switzerland, Hallstatt or one of the other sites. I have the reference, and I'll make the actual chapter and verse available to you. Anyway, glass of this type was manufactured in Europe 400 BC. It was used extensively throughout Europe for several hundred years. It was present in Britain, but it was probably manufactured in Britain using the same technology. So blue glass with white trailing decoration has been found on at least 3 sites in Britain. One was in Cornwall, I believe, and there were 2 others. So not too many. It's a fairly rare and scarce find. So whoever was here and lost it, that was a precious object. An object that was found by the Massam group of archaeology group, the Massam group. They were field walking. They were looking at a ploughed field adjacent to a known Iron Age settlement, and they were half a mile away from the settlement, and it was a ploughed field, and they found a beautiful blue glass bead, and it was a large fat bead. It wasn't a ring, it was a bead, and that bead was taken to the museum, one of the museums on the Roman wall, and the curator there was asked whether they had any finds from the Roman wall which matched this bead. The bead was of the same identical blue glass as the bangle that we found, a section of the bangle that you found. Same glass, but it was a complete bead. Now beads like that were found at that very early site that I mentioned, 400 BC. Beads like that were found on the Roman wall. One bead. There's a whole collection of beads, and there was only one of them like the blue, with the blue and white glass on the Roman wall. So what I'm saying is there's a very good context for that glass bangle, for the glass. It's a high status item. It was quite precious. D-shaped glass bangles are found on Iron Age sites. Trafford-in-Law on the borders, for example, and we've had a section of a glass bangle at Helaw in the excavations, but it was plain white. It wasn't coloured, and it was a, if you like, a Woolworths version of the blue and white glass. So there you are. We have a high status find. It has it can be closely dated. It can be dated from the period from the prehistoric Iron Age through to the period of Roman occupation.